I know what I'm doing. Long time coming. Sorry for the delay. I'll explain. Now, for today, I hope you have some time on your hands. Media is obviously about wrestling. Politics, American elections are obviously about wrestling. This is not an original insight. This has been made by, I think, even New York Times or New Yorker. One of those wrote an essay on Trump and wrestling. And 8 years after it started, people still don't seem to get it. Or the sorts of pundits or the sorts of commentators that say, but Trump's a liar. He didn't help the working class. We already gave him a shot. I'm pretty sure I've even said that. But if you say that, you don't get what he is. And I think it took Durkheim to figure this out, because Trump is a religious figure. This is why he can't be wrong. This is why it doesn't matter. You can't apply these standards of truth and falsity to him. It's a category error, basically. So we're going to talk about wrestling today. I think I've brought up wrestling and kayfabe before in a different context, maybe a live stream or something like that. But after reading Durkheim, it takes on a whole new explanatory value that I'd never realized. And we're going to read a chapter from Roland Barthes today. And here's how it is in terms of the delay. I've basically started several of these video lectures. I know I owe you more, okay? I was unhappy with the theme. I want them to be as fruitful as possible, and I also want to be learning something myself. So breaking down Sam Harris on metaphysics, this is not very productive, not very fun. I'm not learning anything, and I don't feel good about that stuff. There's no that kind of critique is fruitless, because that's what, and I want this to be fruitful. That's what this is all about. So to put something in its place, what I had spent so much time, I read a bunch of Zizek's metaphysics from the 2012 book where he lays out his metaphysics, and I was going to read that and say what was going on. Turns out he ends up with some ontological claims, and I realized, I've seen all this before, and a lot of it has a lot in common with Alain Badiou. So I started reading Alain Badiou on his manifestos for philosophy. I was going to present those to you. The ontological claims, though, they get to an almost nothing, and then how does something come from nothing, and then there's an empty set at the bottom, and things come out of this, and we produce faith, and that's why we believe in truth conditions, basically. I thought this might be entertaining to make little Photoshop graphs out of it, like the little circle things that I'm fond of, but I was not happy with it. And then one day, I woke up and realized I can't do that kind of philosophy. I find that kind of philosophy interesting, metaphysics, ontology. But as soon as you say, basically, let's start at the beginning, let's start at the very first distinction between something and nothing, then I realize I don't believe in any of that. You may agree, you may disagree, you may like it too, but these are basically symbolic logic puzzles, ultimately. And especially the way that Zizek and Badiou and even the object-oriented ontology people, they're kind of the only people still discussing ontology, and not to great effect. And the point is, with ontology, there's basically no stakes. My headphones are telling me that they're low battery. There's basically no stakes, and there's no way to determine if you're correct or incorrect when you're talking about, whether being is singular or multiple, or whether everything comes from an empty set. And as interesting as of a puzzle as it might be, I don't want to do that ever. There's no way to be more right, And he's saying, like, Deleuze is a philosopher of the one, and Deleuze seems to think more that he's a philosopher of the multiple, but you can't be a philosopher of the multiple and be accurate according to Badiou. But there's no way to check any of this. So I kind of decided I don't ever want to talk about philosophy again unless there is an object at the center of the discussion that we are talking about as an example. And that kicked off the Disneyland video. How do I produce this metaphysics with an object? Now the object's not mine. I didn't come up with that, but that's why I'm done with abstraction. I think it's alienating, and I think it's not very useful. And I only want to talk about things via examples. Now, that's a challenge for me because I like the mental puzzles, but I don't like discussing the mental puzzles. Again, there's no stakes. There's no way to prove if being ultimately is singular or multiple. And then we're talking about quantum physics. Does that have anything to do with philosophy? I think probably not really. It's a niche hobby interest connection that has very few stakes. But wrestling has some stakes, as I hope to show you through a reading today. One thing I did pick up reading Alain Badiou is I think that we have inherited conventional baggage from especially Christian philosophy, which was most of philosophy in the West, by connecting the true, the good, and the beautiful together, which is, Platonic, and Badiou draws a lot from Plato. He makes truth conditions for each of these different things in his system. I'm not going to talk about, but that what is ethically good is also what is true, and that's also going to lead to the most aesthetic, sublime sorts of beauty. I think that given the current state of affairs, we need to do away with that connection between those things and deal with each of them dying on their own terms. We know that Nietzsche, with Beyond Good and Evil, was very concerned with the good-evil distinction, overcoming the good. And the latter half of the 20th century, I think the target is more the true false distinction, and messing it up, complicating it, showing that it's not, like, what's true is not necessarily what's more valuable. And then we have everything we can throw in there. Sociology, the elementary forms of religious life, Bernays on advertising. Maybe that's a critique, an implied critique of the beautiful. Death of art, death of morality, death of truth, the disappearance, the mirror of disappearance, and all that stuff. And this is why I made the Disneyland video the way that I did. I don't want to talk about truth as a logic puzzle. I don't want to talk about truth in symbolic terms. I want to talk about it only with respect to concrete objects that are easily recognizable. Less abstraction, fewer abstractions. And again, that's difficult for me because that's how I tend to think. But I've been writing a lot about what I privately think about this distinction between thought and being. And I only want to discuss that with examples. Disneyland is the example, but let me summarize once again quickly so this makes sense what Disneyland means. Disneyland is to believe. And this is what values are for Nietzsche, that beliefs tend to be worth more than truths, despite the fact that philosophy has been conceded always, and even natural philosophy, science, has been conceded towards truths. Now, truths are very useful, particularly in things like science and engineering. But they aren't the most useful, and just because they are very useful in a context doesn't mean that they're the thing that we should be looking at. Again, it's a conceit of pundits to say, well, Trump is unfit to be president because he lies. That's a category mistake. And Badiou, I'm sorry if you don't know who Badiou is. I think we covered him in one or two podcasts before. Alain Badiou, he's a Maoist Platonist, math realist. he's one of the most interesting people that are still dealing with philosophy. But I think he's doing it in a rearguard action, which is why he had to write 2 manifestos for philosophy, saying that philosophy still matters. Philosophy is still its own thing, and we can't get rid of it. It's still really important. And I think even writing 2 manifestos proves that this is sort of a rearguard action, and that we might as well sound the death knell for philosophy as an effective discipline in the modern world. But anyway, his second manifesto for philosophy specifically is saying that we appear to be losing truths. And we appear to be losing truths because no one understands truth procedures properly anymore. Basically, philosophy exists and it's still there to be able to do its thing, but it's being drowned out by cultural noise. Noise where philosophy means, your brand philosophy, that you are promoting wellness because you are mixing some FDA unapproved Indian herb into some potion and calling it a sex potion, like Gwyneth Paltrow. For me, though, contrary to writing a manifesto for philosophy, I tend to see around us that it's more likely that truth has imploded as a value. And truth has always been opposed to values because truth, via its connection to the good and the beautiful, it's supposed to have intrinsic value. It's supposed to have value outside of valuing. And, most of what I say is that, no, valuing is the thing that produces truths, not truths produce valuing, which makes me, in Badiou's terms, an anti-philosopher. And he doesn't use anti-philosopher, it's negative. It's obviously negative. But he sees anti-philosophy as a good thing because it hones philosophy to, be the best version of itself. And anti-philosophers are a bunch of cool people. Like Wittgenstein, for example, is up there. He also thinks that semiotics is a kind of anti-philosophy. And what I want to focus on today is taking semiotics seriously, because I think anti-philosophy is not merely anti-philosophy, but some sort of, it comes out of the same ground of what we call knowledge that philosophy does. And if you take semiotics very seriously, which I'm pretty sure I do, then truths cannot precede languages. Badiou thinks that anachronistically truths do precede languages, but we can't get too focused on signs because then we're going to lose truth procedures. And he gives quite a complicated analysis of that. I happen just to think that he's hopeful. He's perhaps nostalgic. And this is where Durkheim, reading him after all these years, kind of blew my mind. To put the sacred profane distinction as the precedent of any sort of knowledge system. It's a distinction prior to the phenomenon-noumenon distinction that I've pretty much been operating with as truth. I'm mostly neo-Kantian in that sense, I think you could say. I'm not going to argue, though, about the sacred profane distinction. I'd rather show you with the example. So at long last, 15 minutes in, we'll come to it. To see if truth has imploded or if it hasn't, which just is to mean that truth is no longer effective as an appeal, because you need authority to appeal to something, to get people to believe in that more than they believe in something else. And we see this with the age-old conflict between religion, and I want to use religion in a broad term, the sense in which Trump is a religious figure, and science. Let me find this. Okay, here's Durkheim. We have this conflict between public authority moral authority, which is society itself. And the other name for society itself as moral authority is for him God. And eventually it becomes the gods that we know, God or Allah or even Zeus, whatever. But before any of that happens, we have an external moral authority that we feel inside and project it outwards, but it's also outside in other people projected at us. So it's a back and forth. And science comes into conflict with religion. It has throughout the, Socrates as scientist, Socrates as one who has knowledge, comes into conflict with the state and gets shut down, and then the Galileo and whatever popular examples you want to use. But science achieved its own sense of authority, which is why there was an antagonistic relationship between them. And here we say, opinion. Now, opinion is like a primary force for Durkheim. Opinion, a preeminently social thing, is therefore a source of authority, and we can even speculate whether all authority is not the daughter of opinion. That's a huge claim if you think about that. The social is always first, and even challenging the social is a form of, sociability, which is going to be important in our wrestling discussion. But then he answers this objection. Some will object that science is often the combative antagonist of opinion, fixing its errors. And we can fit science into philosophy into science there, as they tend to be gadflies that are saying opinion is the enemy of truth. But science can succeed in this task only if it has sufficient authority and it can draw this opinion, it can draw this authority only from opinion itself. So he's a little bit hesitant to make the claim here, but ultimately, opinion is the ultimate social authority over everything that we might call a discourse, including scientific discourse. And now this is to say, science can only combat public opinion, which can be whatever. It's usually meant to produce group homogeneity in a sense, but truth can only come in to correct that if there's enough faith in truth. And if it's true that we have separated, first of all, morality from truth, which is kind of Nietzsche's grand contribution, and now we're separating truth from opinion, but then saying that opinion is better, that's what it would mean to live in a post-truth age, in a kayfabe age, in an age when scientists are warning of all these impending dangers and where you can't trust vaccines and where you can't trust truth. The person you can trust is your guy, your figurehead, your religion character. And then science, if there's not enough pushback from science, then you're going to be screwed if your rubric is measuring truth versus falsity. That rubric simply doesn't work when opinion doesn't care about truth because it's in a different register. It's in a religious register. And I think there's great case to be made that that's what's happening, at least perhaps not globally, but for sure American politics signals the end of truth as a rubric. People just don't care. And wrestling is interesting because it's literally never had truth as a rubric. It's always had faith and belief as the measure of success and failure in wrestling as an enterprise, or what was first called catch wrestling. They would do it at carnivals. Wrestling, we know there's like a Roman wrestling or Olympic wrestling. These are very early, these split off. They're basically contemporaneous, which is show wrestling and WWE versus wrestling as a quote-unquote real sport. Okay, so to understand the social, We need to understand belief and non-belief as the primary distinction. And then to understand belief and non-belief, we have to understand wrestling. And I've never watched a full wrestling match in my life. I'm not a fan or anything like that. But I did watch there's a new Netflix series on the head of the WWE, or former head until recently. His name is Vince McMahon. And it was honestly mind-blowing as a miniseries. The whole thing, I don't, just look at it if you want. You'll see where I'm coming from at the fourth episode or so. Then it turns into sort of an expose. But if we're talking about a microcosm of everything else that's going on, you know, the theory joke I made, that just looking for something and calling it a microcosm of all of society, what critical theory does, if it's not true here, it's not true anywhere. Because Vince McMahon, like, morally bankrupt character, basically, but he's also the singular genius behind WWE and WWF, as it used to be known. The guy is absolutely truthless, moralless, aestheticless. He's the absolute antinomy to any philosopher that has ever existed, pretty much. Insofar as philosophy is recovering the truth conditions of the true, good, and the beautiful, this guy is Satan himself. He believes in absolutely nothing except ratings and money. No dignity. He will sacrifice himself. He will make himself into an absolutely hated, putrid figure because it makes him money and gets ratings. And he understands that, like, practically before anyone else, unless you want to count Trump in that category, but he understands that belief is the only currency of any value now. Truth has basically lost its currency, or is kind of losing its currency, or at least truth and philosophy and academic research, this is being pushed into a more narrow category of boringness, where, like, why would we look at that? It's boring. I don't want to look at facts. I want to believe in things again. It's the return of the social that's kind of repressed in, if you want to call it, Enlightenment values. So this is my grand story. And Vince McMahon, both a figure and admirable, but also by any other metric, just a putrid, disgusting person. But he has the same table of values, basically, as Trump. It doesn't matter if people hate you, because if they hate you, then they're watching you. And social media has turned into this as well, where people are fine with being completely embarrassed by virtually everyone thinking they're an idiot, putting their idiocy on display, and they're happy with that because they get attention. Now, this is known, of course, in wrestling as being a heel. It's existed since the very beginning. I'm going to read Roland Barthes today, who is a French, perhaps the first French post-structuralist, and he's writing on wrestling in Paris in the 1950s. And basically, it's a one-to-one transfer to wrestling up until 1993, when it changes. But anyway, no surprise, it's in a book called Mythologies. I'm not sure whether Barthes read Durkheim. I would suspect he probably did, because of the massive parallels here. And he wrote a book called Mythologies that looks for mythology in soap commercials and army recruitment posters and wrestling. And now I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I haven't talked about this for at least 3 years, and certainly not in this register. But anyway, no surprise. Wrestling, the wrestling spectacle, it's not even a parody of totemic religion. It is straight up totemic religion, which is to say that it understands that belief is value. Let me find... Belief is value, and philosophy, it's dating itself, it's making itself passé by assuming that the value is always intrinsic to the truth. It's in its connection to the truth. So we see attacks coming at this notion from all sides, particularly in what is now called post-structuralism, because it's supposed to be in there. Truth is supposed to be in truth, and it's supposed to emerge in time and have some degree of stability to it. Badiou is saying it is still there. It's getting fragile, it's getting attacked from all sides, but it's still in there. And someone like Derrida is saying, I'm not so sure it's still in there, I'm not sure where it is, but it's for sure not in Hegel. At least we know that. So when we get to the semiotic register, and that's the register that we're coming out of, and I think we have not really understood semiotics, or academic philosophers at least have not really understood semiotics, where value is not in truth, it is truth itself that is the value. The symbolic, in other terms, I guess, the symbolic is not true, but it's how you get to a point where the truth can become anything. But the truth is a subdiscipline of philosophers, which are a subdiscipline of society in general. And I think we need this society in general understanding first to get outside of our Enlightenment bias, and wrestling here is kind of the best way to do it. And yeah, here we go with Mr. Roland Barthes. This is from the book Mythologies, and we got 5 pages here on wrestling. And this shows the implosion. All right. So for Barthes, a wrestling match is basically a reality or a morality play. There's a little slip there. Everyone knows it's fake. No one can admit, though, that it's fake. It's like I'm going to call this classical wrestling, because wrestling really changes in the 90s. Here you can see some of what wrestling looks like. This is in the 90s when it all changes. But anyway, for Barthes, which we're going to read in a sec, there's a good guy who's known as the baby face. There you see The Rock. He's one of the baby faces. And then there's a heel, and those are the bad guys. The heel's job, this is Vince McMahon, the main heel. He turned himself into a character in his own company, and he's the most hated guy. He's hated in a theatrical sense, the way you hate like a comic book villain. But up until in the age that Roland Barthes is writing, this is very strictly light versus dark, good versus evil, and we're going to go through that a little bit. But there's a guy you're meant to hate, and then a guy you're meant to love. And basically through the arc, you know, the bad guy might win some rounds. He might even win a fight, but then the good guy will return to have victory later. Basically, we are putting social morality on display where the good guy ultimately triumphs. So it's very simplistic, just as all morality plays in like the Middle Ages are, which means good triumphs over evil, and evil will be punished. And evil is primarily, I mean, depending on the context, evil is the guy that you hate, and you hate him because he's rude to you, he doesn't sign autographs, he uses bad language. In the American context, he might be Russian or Iranian, but you know that they're going to eventually lose. Now, this video is called the Attitude Era, which is something that I've been reading about for the last couple days and learned about only recently. But the Attitude Era is when all of my peers were watching wrestling in like elementary school, and I didn't watch it. I don't know why. I just never. Maybe I was just too high-minded, philosophical-minded. But you know, this guy, most famous guy, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and they all do this like "suck it" the suck it thing. This is when morality becomes blurred. But the time that Bart is writing is in 1950, and this is I might as well just call it classical wrestling. And Hulk Hogan, despite the fact that he becomes a heel later, he's like the ultimate, the best known babyface because he's like Superman, he's Mr. America. And here, this is his first antagonist is the Iron Sheik because he's Iranian. One of his other main antagonist is a Russian guy. So the Stone Cold Steve Austin thing, this dude, to keep this in the back of your mind, because we're going to get there once social morality collapses, or at least shifts. It shifts from one kind of good and evil to another kind of good and evil. His goodness, despite the fact that in any other age of wrestling, he says bad words, he says fuck everything, he runs around with his middle finger up, he punches good guys, other good guys like The Rock, maybe. I'm pretty sure they were contemporaries. I might need some corrections on my timelines here. I'm very new to this. I've only been studying it for 4 days. But he's a Texan boy, basically. One thing that makes him bad, if you've heard of this, Austin 316, this is a reference to in football matches when people would put John 3:16 up and hold the sign up because it's the Bible verse. Austin 3:16, for a guy from Texas, this is sacrilege. So he's anti-Christian, anti-system, anti-people. He doesn't sign autographs. He's a jerk to the good people. So he should be a heel. But this shows a reversal in morality that happens in the 90s, and this is sort of a mirror of that. What makes him good is that this guy, Vince McMahon, becomes the worst heel, and he represents the system. He's the owner. He tries to fire Steve Austin or won't pay him. He steals wrestlers' girlfriends. And, you know, there's like a bit of truth to this in real life outside of the play, but mostly in the morality play, he's willing to put himself on stage and become the most hated heel of all time. And it's because he represents the system. And obviously, it doesn't take a genius to know that there's a reflection in working class sort of blue collar America that the system is fucking you over. And when the system is fucking you over, then someone who is evil in every other era now becomes the face, now becomes the good guy. So we see the good and evil distinction persists, although everything that used to be called good in Hulk Hogan defeating Iran as the good old American boy, this all becomes reversed or shifts. And this is why you need wrestling in part to understand Trump, because it doesn't matter whether Trump does anything good or bad, as long as you can put him into the moral system as someone who's against the system. Then after that, nothing he does matters because he's a religious figure. It's right because he does it and because he's against the system. So back here, this is in 1984. You can see the date. We're going to be reading from Roland Barthes, who was writing in the 50s. So wrestling basically stayed the same until about mid-90s. And mid-90s, the morality system shifts. But back in the Hulk Hogan era, Hulk Hogan is Superman. He's Mr. America versus the Russians versus the Iranians. And this is sort of a black and white morality play. So think of this in terms of totemic religion, a la Durkheim, of course. There's no irony. There's no ambiguity. This is pretty much a religious spectacle in microcosm. French wrestling is a little bit different from American wrestling because they have a different morality system, which Bart will get to. But in terms of what we call religions, like Christianity or Islam, this is not religious in that sense, of course. This is religious in Durkheim's sense, where moral authority exists with certain figures, and we love to put it on to certain figures. And the worst thing you can do as a moral figure is disrupt kayfabe. So kayfabe, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this before. I'm sorry, but for a review, kayfabe is a word of contentious etymology. It basically means the fakeness of the spectacle, and you have to maintain the fakeness of the spectacle even when the wrestling match is over. You have to maintain it in everyday life. You have to maintain it while you're doing interviews. The good guy has to go and sign autographs and shake hands with the people and be a good guy, whereas the heel, the bad guy, says, fuck off, and they cannot be seen in the same car together. They cannot embrace. They cannot... They have to pretend that the enemies or the rivalries that exist in the wrestling ring persist throughout all of life. And that is the main morality of wrestling, is to not break kayfabe, even despite the fact these guys are probably having lunch together backstage. They're probably friends. I think these two, if I'm getting it right, I think these two actually, they were drunk driving. One of them was drunk driving, and they got arrested in the same car. And this was a scandal, right? It was a scandal because they were in the same car, despite the fact that they are mortal enemies. They're sides of this Manichaean circle, one good and one evil. They can't have anything to do with each other, despite the fact, and this is the crazy bit with simulation and all that, despite the fact that everybody knows this is a show, and they've known that since the beginning. And wrestling starts in carnivals, like I said, carnivals in like the early 1900s. So even more than that, you have every other aspect of totemism in here. All the characters come from mythology. Let me find this a second. Okay, so random page, just searched it. You see from totemism, you choose your individual totem, right? Your animal spirit, basically. We have the animal spirits. We have the feathers. This is like a bird magic thing. And more than that, you have fairy tale characters like the Undertaker, clowns, fairy tale characters, every aspect of Americana and everything preceding Americana, European fairy tales, it all appears here. So this guy's got a bird spirit. And you see this recycled. You see the recycling of all imagery of all Western civilization. You got cowboys, you got working class boys, you got knights, clowns, wizards, anything you can think of, you got it recycled here. Every other race, for example, right? And they're usually racist stereotypes. Like the Iron Sheik is evil because he's from Iran. All right. I'm not doing audio because I'll get copyright blocked for it, but you basically know what wrestling looks like. So, a lot of familiar terms in here, so let's read. This is the mythology of wrestling. Bart is coming off of semiotics, pretty much. I think Death of the Author is around this time as well. And he's saying, my object of study, kind of like I opened up with, my object of study is not going to be the semiotics of Baudelaire, for example, or great French literature, as most people were doing, most structuralists were doing. because my object of study is going to be pop culture. He was kind of the first to do it. And I'm going to read the first 3 paragraphs to give you a flavor of this. The virtue of all-in wrestling is that it is the spectacle of excess. Here we find a grandiloquence which must have been that of ancient theaters. And in fact, wrestling is an open-air spectacle. For what makes the circus or the arena what they are is not the sky, a romantic value suited rather to fashionable occasions. It is the drenching, vertical quality of the flood of light. Even hidden in the most squalid Parisian halls, wrestling partakes of the nature of the great solar spectacles, Greek drama, and bullfights. In both, a light without shadow generates an emotion without reserve. So, yeah, these happen they happen indoors in dingy, second-rate halls, not outside under the open sky like Greek drama would have. But we have the electric lights here. He's just waxing poetic for the intro. All right. There are people who think that wrestling is an ignoble sport. Wrestling is not a sport. It is a spectacle. And it is no more ignoble to attend the wrestled performance of suffering than a performance of sorrows of Arnulf or Andromache. So he's saying this is theater, and it's not just theater, it's even great theater. It's like seeing a tragedy. Of course, there exists a false wrestling in which participants unnecessarily go to great lengths to make show of a fair fight. This is of no interest. So false wrestling is what we would call real wrestling, a real sport. But that's not where true wrestling is. True wrestling, wrongly called amateur wrestling, is performed in second-rate halls where the public spontaneously attunes itself to the spectacular nature of the contest, like the audience at a suburban cinema. Then these same people wax indignant because wrestling is a stage-managed sport, which ought, by the way, to mitigate its ignominy. The public is completely uninterested in knowing whether the contest is rigged or not, and rightly so. It abandons itself to the primary virtue of the spectacle, which is to abolish all motives and all consequences. What matters is not what it thinks, but what it sees. The it there meaning the public. So, it's fake. The end is predetermined. Some of the moves are predetermined. That's not what matters. It's not a real sport. No one expects it to be one, and real wrestling is really boring. So it has more in common with theater and with sports. This public knows very well the distinction between wrestling and boxing. It knows that boxing is a Jansenist sport based on a demonstration of excellence. Jansenism is a Catholic counter-Reformation tradition. And I don't exactly know why he's using it here, but I think it's like boxing is meritocratic. It's about hard work. It's about sticking to the grind without knowing the outcome. Jansenism in Catholicism is basically like the counter-Reformation version of Calvinism. Calvinism similarly is you don't know if you're getting to heaven, so put your nose down. Get to work, and don't worry about the world. Just do your job, and God will see that it gets worked out in the end. So boxing is that sort of thing. Boxing is grind it out because you don't know the outcome. And then based on a demonstration of excellence, the better boxer wins. One can bet on the outcome of a boxing match. With wrestling, that would make no sense. A boxing match is a story which is constructed before the eyes of the spectator. In wrestling, on the contrary, it is each moment which is intelligible, not the passage of time. The spectator is not interested in the rise and fall of fortunes. He expects the transient image of certain passions, beliefs. Wrestling therefore demands an immediate reading of the juxtaposed meanings so that there is no need to connect them. The logical conclusion of the contest does not interest the wrestling fan, because, of course, the outcome's predetermined. While on the contrary, a boxing match always implies a science of the future. In other words, wrestling is a sum of spectacles in which no single one is a function. Each moment imposes the total knowledge of a passion which rises erect and alone, without ever extending to the crowning moment of a result. So I'll take a shot at explaining what this means. He's speaking grandiloquently, we'll say. But what this means is, one sec. So basically, it's a category error to confuse wrestling with sports. Wrestling is closer to something like theater. I've done some reading on this the last couple of days, and everybody academically says the same thing. He was the first to say it, though, like 60 years ago. Now we have an analysis of temporality. Boxing is a struggle of temporality because anything that happens at any moment might change the end result in boxing, or a real, quote unquote, real sport. But in wrestling, when the end is already fixed, this is why it's called fake or not real. But it just takes on it should just be analyzed differently. Boxing fans will say that wrestling is not a real sport, as will many other commentators. But real versus fake, that distinction is just simply speaking about the undetermined outcome, kind of. Because if the outcome is fixed instead of undetermined, then everything that happens in the fight, a temporary pin, a big punch, a surprise guest coming out, all of that takes on meaning because you know that all the things are planned. And that makes wrestling more meaningful, actually. At least the process of what's taking place. Like, why is this event being included? Why is this particular spectacle being included? It has meaning because they planned it. Just like, the simplest way to say is like the ending. You know the ending of a Marvel film, which is that the good guy wins and discovers something about himself. You know the whole film is planned, but still you don't want spoilers. Even though you know the ending, it makes the elements of the journey, the hero's journey, blah, 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 it makes that all meaningful. So in wrestling, of course, it's the journey, not the destination, that matters. And it's the journey that spectators go to become a part of as a faith community. And thus the function of the wrestler is not to win, of course. It's to be spectacular in everything that you do, which means putting on exaggerated faces. If you're being pinned, look like you're really being pinned and you're not going to get out this time. Even though if you're the good guy, everyone still knows you're going to get out this time. So everything becomes exaggerated, and he says that here. So there's an idea of nature or necessity. Necessity is like nature in the Greek sense, more or less. But the function of all this exaggeration is the same as the ancient theater, he says, whose principle, language, and props, masks and buskins, I don't know what that is, just say masks and costumes, they concur in the exaggeratedly visible explanation of necessity. We're going to come back to what that means. The gesture of the vanquished wrestler signifying the world a defeat, which, far from disguising, he emphasizes and holds like a pause in music, corresponds to the mask of antiquity, meant to signify the tragic mode of the spectacle. In wrestling, as on the stage in antiquity, one is not ashamed of one's suffering. One knows how to cry, has a liking for tears. And you see this in they're not very good actors. I've seen a couple of wrestling matches in the last couple of days. They're not very good actors. It's like porn acting, basically. But they have to exude presence so that everyone in the stadium can see them. So all the gestures are something like a theater stage. And there is a stage setting that happens. There's a stage setting that happens. And in real sports, the meaning is almost all in the end result. In wrestling, conversely, the meaning is in every aspect of the journey up to the end result. Because in a real sport, if there's like a fumble or if another team takes a big lead, you don't know whether that contributes to the end result or not. They could be meaningful, they could be flukes, they could be accidents. And we watch both sports and wrestling for the drama. The difference is one's planned drama. So you basically expect more from wrestling knowing that it's planned. Now, if you think of social media politics, post-world politics, is this more of the thing, kind of like boxing, where you're trying to win and the end is undetermined? Or is it more like wrestling where you know you won't win, so you're trying to overload every instance of, online combat with as much imaginary content and moral meaning as possible? Like, this is a bad guy. This is the kind of guy that you should hate. I am the kind of guy that you should like. And you're speaking to your different groups. So is online politics, is it more like wrestling where you're not trying to win? Or is it more like boxing where the end result determines it? And I think probably the answer is wrestling there. The next paragraph, we come to the roles of the signs in wrestling. And I said in English terms, or in our terms, we call one the baby face and one is the heel. It's the good guy and the bad guy until the 90s. Each sign, there we go. Each sign in wrestling is therefore endowed with an absolute clarity, since one must understand everything on the spot. This is another thing about wrestling, is that there's no depth. It's not meant to be interpreted except immediately. Like, what you see is what you get. As soon as the adversaries are in the ring, the public is overwhelmed with the obviousness of the roles. As in the theater, each physical type expresses to excess the part which has been assigned to the contestant. Sylvain, a 50-year-old with an obese and sagging body whose type of asexual hideousness always inspires feminine nicknames, displays in his flesh the characters of baseness. For his part is to represent that which, in the classical concept of the salud, the bastard, that's the heel, the key concept of any wrestling match, appears as organically repugnant. So here we have the heel. The heel, you can tell before they even do anything in many cases that they are the heel because they look ugly. And in American form, here, I don't even need to press play. In American form, we have this. How do you know he's evil? Because he's dressed in Iranian garb. The Russian, of course, will wear red. That's how we know that he is bad. But they can also be ugly. Heels tend to have more face makeup, whereas the baby face is often clean shaven. Hulk Hogan's an exception to that. It's not always the case, but you can basically tell what Bart's saying. You don't need to interpret anything. It's written on their appearance what their role is. And that's where we tap into the semiotic register for the first time. It is therefore in the body of the wrestler that we find the first key to the contest, and that's the first signs of the contest. I know from the start, it's the same with Disney characters, right? You can tell, Scar is an evil character. Why? Because he's darker than Mufasa. He's less strong, more effeminate, treacherous, all that. But you know that from the very start of the film. It's like, this is Disney level morality, and it's meant to be Disney level morality because in Durkheimian terms, the whole spectacle is meant to reproduce the social authority structure of that society's morality, which is more or less cross-cultural, except we're going to see a few differences between the French and the Americans in this essay. Back to the text. It is therefore in the body of the wrestler that we find the first key to the contest. I know from the start that all of Thauvin, the heel, his actions, his treacheries, cruelties, and acts of cowardice will not fail to measure up to the first image of ignobility he gave me. I can trust him to carry out intelligently and to the last detail all the gestures of a kind of amorphous baseness, and to fill to the brim the image of the most repugnant bastard there is, the bastard octopus. No idea what the bastard octopus is, but I guess he's fulfilling every role. He goes through a few other examples specific to French culture that I don't really understand. But I think the best example to take away from this is like Disney morality, that is the morality of wrestling. You know that Jafar is bad because of how he looks. Ursula, Scar, versus the heroes of those stories who are young, beautiful, and so on. The morality is written into appearance. This is actually a Greek idea too. Nietzsche says that the Greeks were right to distrust Socrates because he was so ugly. They were spending time, admonishing and heaping praise upon their heroes because they knew what good values were, and Socrates ruined all that for us. Now, none of this, I don't think, yet is all that interesting because we know this, and in the 50s, even the post-structuralists knew it. But it's kind of, you got to give him some credit. This is a more original analysis than it seems to us because we've heard it so much. But in hindsight, even if it's not all that interesting, this is what we, culturally believed at some point. Now we call this children's stuff, but children are still meant to believe it. It's what Marvel movies still are. It's what Star Wars is. The bad guys have red lightsabers and the good guys have blue lightsabers or green. And then once our morality gets corrupted, then you can have any color lightsaber, maybe. But obviously this is childlike morality. And this changes a little bit, right? In the 90s, at the same time as wrestling is changing to this, our other entertainment products change too. Largely, I'd say, with The Sopranos, shows like that, prestige TV. This is TV that's really made for adults. This is not a sitcom. And we have like Tony Soprano, who's the primordial TV antihero. And after that, we have Walter White, and Steve Austin is contemporaneous, basically, with Tony Soprano. And then later on, we get Donald Trump. Donald Trump is basically a Steve Austin figure because he's taking on the establishment. It doesn't matter what he's done wrong. All that matters is how he fits into the morality play. And if you're against the system, then you are immediately also good. That's kind of fast forwarding from what Barth is saying, but Barth is writing in the 50s, so you do have to update it a little bit. We have all the same signs that indicate, goodness from badness, though. I guess in the politics case, it's perhaps not so immediate as he's saying in terms of having signs to understand who's good and who's evil. But certainly from the perspective of inside the Trump cult, Hillary is a conniving betrayer of the middle class. Her husband was supposed to be a Democrat, and he did NAFTA and all the things that they hate. Democrats want to break down the whiteness of America by letting in immigrants who will sway the vote in their favor. And then we have, Trump, the blonde hero on the other side. Anyway, in either case, what we see, whether the morality is good versus evil, as in here, or whether it's the tough, strong guy against the rigged system, which is Trump and Stone Cold. Either way, we see that everything, all signs are recruited into this narrative. And what matters is that the moral system, like unlike for previous philosophers, unlike for Kantian morality, where you can determine rationally in any scenario what the moral thing to do is, or with utilitarian ethics, like you add up the good on one side and add up the negative on the other, but you're only responsible for your motivations, not for the consequences. Any type of moral system like this is based on calculation. This is not based on calculation. This is based on mere image, pure appearance. And it sounds Baudrillardian, but it's at least 15 years before Baudrillard is even writing his first book. And Barth's saying this. And he doesn't say it here, but you get the sense from reading that this is all based on signs, that there is nothing really underneath all of this. If we read Durkheim, there is a sort of moral authority underneath all of this, but it's certainly not for pretty much any of these guys. It's not the idea of the good that really underpins this. The idea of the good was a particular construct that can go through different changes. It appears differently in different cultures, but we have a unified mythology that gives wrestling its charm, and that mythology is built up from cultural signs, like dress, costume, masks, exaggerations of reality. And this is the same thing as it was in the Greek theater. If you have a guy wearing an ugly mask, he's the bad guy. If you have a guy without a mask, he's the good guy. So in wrestling, as opposed to a real sport, as opposed to boxing, everything is a symbolic, and it's symbolically created between the characters, the wrestlers, and the audience, which is why this concept of kayfabe becomes so important. Because if you ever let it slip that a sign is just a sign, then the whole narrative will fall apart around it. So signs function only while we suspend disbelief in them. And that's where I'm going to be going with this. So in terms of sign analysis, we have this. The physique of the wrestlers therefore constitutes a basic sign, which, like a seed, contains the whole fight. Heels are older. They sometimes wear masks. They sometimes wear makeup. They sometimes wear dresses. I found that interesting. They're the ones bending social norms. They're bending gender by, cross-dressing. They're usually older as opposed to the faces. Baby face means they're young looking, right? The youth versus the aged. And they're also physically fit. Heels, if there's a fat guy, he's probably a heel, not a baby face. So, and here's the further sign analysis. We are therefore dealing with a real human comedy, where the most socially inspired nuances of passion, conceit, rightfulness or righteousness, refined cruelty, and a sense of paying one's debts always felicitously find the clearest sign which can receive them, express them, and triumphantly carry them to the confines of the hall. It is obvious that at such a pitch, it no longer matters whether the passion is genuine or not. And think back if you can. I don't want to turn back to it because it might waste too much time here, but Durkheim speaks of when a crowd and a speaker are speaking back and forth. Think of a politician or a preacher. They feed off each other, and it becomes this intensity. And it becomes a sort of intensity where the crowd is in the speaker, and the speaker is ecstasized from his body, in a sense. And between them, the social is created. And that's like you can call it a church atmosphere or a political rally, but it's also the same thing that becomes concretized in a cult or something like that. It's a cultic structure where the speaker becomes a figure of something much greater than what he or she actually is. And that's by absorbing the effervescence, which is one of Durkheim's favorite terms, the energy, the psychic energy of the crowd. And in that intensity, just like in wrestling, in the intensity of a cult or a church service or a wrestling match, whether or not the person is saying anything true, or whether or not, I should just say that truth or falsity as a standard of measurement of behavior or even words, this doesn't matter anymore. It loses itself in the intensity of the spectacle of it. A little bit of crowd psychology in germ coming out here. And sorry, Roland Barthes was blanking. Roland Barthes picks up on the same thing. What the public wants is the image of passion, not passion itself. That's why the wrestlers are putting on these exaggerated faces of they hate each other, they're enraged at each other, or they're in severe pain when they're getting pinned, or when they're stuck in an arm bar. You can see them, everything becomes exaggerated and pitched to such a high degree. And I could not help but thinking how the YouTube algorithm for a couple years was just based on destruction and like debate as a combat sport, and debate as not as the outcome but as the process to the outcome. How many onages did you get in there? That's not kind of the same thing. It is the same thing. It's the social effervescence of following your leader into battle, maybe. Sorry, where was I? There is no more a problem of truth in wrestling than in the theater. In both, what is expected is the intelligible representation of moral situations which are usually private. This emptying out of interiority to the benefit of its exterior signs, its surface, this exhaustion of the content by the form is the very principle of triumphant classical art. Wrestling is an immediate pantomime. As opposed to like a novel or what we'd call like good TV or good movies that have to be interpreted with moral ambiguity. No, this is like children's morality, and that children's morality is meant to get you into a fever pitch, that you feel catharsis. You feel like justice has been done when your guy wins the fight. And that's a feeling that you don't get from regular sports, because usually the underdog doesn't win. If there's an underdog in wrestling or an underdog in a film, you can bet that they're going to win. And when the underdog does win in real sports, that's like a great moment that goes down into history, depending on the odds that they have to overcome. But wrestling does that every single match, right? The wrestler's gesture needs no anecdote, no decor, in short, no transference in order to appear true. And that might sound like word salad, but no, the transference in order to appear true comes from the understanding that the truth of language is not in the system of language, but in reality, which is the most common still today understanding of signs. The signs, they get their meaning from what they represent. We see a proto, I hate the term, but proto-postmodernism here by saying, no, you can change the signs around as you want. What we want is the signs of victory. We don't care if there's an actual victory. There isn't an actual victory because this whole thing is a play. It's a show. So real victory has not been achieved, but if we can get the signs of real victory, that's enough to call it a successful night or a successful spectacle or a successful wrestling match. Surface. And here on this page, we get to the true meaning of wrestling, which is justice. Now, I've read some academic papers on this. There's actually a institute of professional wrestling studies. That's a bunch of authors. First of all, they misuse Baudrillard's hyperreality by calling wrestling hyperreal. Obviously, it's not. It's imaginary. It's a Disneyland. But they also made a lot of hay out of Barth saying that wrestling's about justice. Now, I'm pretty sure that Barth doesn't believe there's anything called justice except as reproduced by these signs. Now, wrestling is not the only thing that produces justice, but justice is reproduced by ritual, and primarily this ritual. And they were saying that, no, this is giving us a feeling of real justice, which I think is just a blatant misreading, because no French guy, none of these French guys believe that justice is a true ideal that lives on out there. In Durkheimian form, I think they all like come down from this, that justice is the thing that is made up so that society can keep functioning, but you can't make it up once. You have to repeat justice through rituals, through movies, through film, through art, through TV. If you have the bad guy winning every single time, that's not going to be a satisfying film, which is why we watch films, or children's films at least, already knowing the ending. But let's just read this paragraph. What is thus displayed for the public is the great spectacle of suffering, defeat, and justice. That's why the good guy always has to be the underdog, because he needs to suffer first, hero's journey, stuff like that. Wrestling presents man's suffering with all the amplification of tragic masks. The wrestler who suffers in a hold, which is reputedly cruel, an arm lock, a twisted leg, offers an excessive portrayal of suffering, on his face. Like a primitive paeta. That's a paeta. I don't know how to say it, but whatever it is. It's one of the statues of Mary holding her dead son. Where the emotional resonance of the scene is like immediately obvious. A mother holding her dead kid, and the pinning or halfway pinning through the struggle of the match, where the good guy gets pinned down, and you go, "Oh no, is he gonna get up or not?" That's the sign here that the good on earth will suffer. That's the moral. But it is obvious, of course, that in wrestling, reserve would be out of place. Reserve meaning holding back or not emoting as much as possible. Reserve would be out of place since it is opposed to the voluntary ostentation of the spectacle, to this exhibition of suffering, which is the very aim of the fight. This is why all the actions which produce suffering are particularly spectacular, like the gesture of a conjurer who holds out his cards clearly to the public. Suffering, which appeared without intelligible cause, would not be understood. A concealed action that was actually cruel would transgress the unwritten rules of wrestling and would have no more sociological efficacy than a mad or parasitic gesture. On the contrary, suffering appears as inflicted with emphasis and conviction, for everyone must not only see that man suffers, but also, and above all, be understood why he suffers. So I don't know if that came across what he's saying there, but in traditional sports, having played traditional sports, when the ref's not looking and you think you can get away with something. Of course, I would never do this because I'm a babyface hero. But if you're a bad person, you wait till the ref's not looking, and you see if the guy has a cup on, chop him in the nuts or something, or accidentally Charlie horse if you're playing like soccer or something like that. If you can get away with it, you try to get away with it, but subtly. Now, subtlety, of course, as he's saying, this is kind of obvious. Subtlety has no place in wrestling. If a guy is bad, that means he's going to very obviously give the guy a Charlie horse or do something ignoble, like kicking the opponent in the nuts. That's not a masculine, manly thing to do. A masculine, manly thing to do is to punch him in the head and square up, not punch him in the back of the head, not kick him in the nuts, sportsmanlike. So that's another differentiation between real sports and private sports, and yeah, everything has to be on display. Nothing hidden happens in a wrestling match, basically. And if it happens, and it's not seen or it's not on purpose, then it's probably an accident, and they have a name for that too. But anyway, what did I say here? Yeah, it has to be understood why he suffers. That's what I just reiterated. What wrestlers call a hold, that is, any figure which allow him to immobilize the adversary. I think he's writing to people who have never seen a wrestling match, probably, the hoity-toity French intellectuals, so that's why we're getting this level of detail. It wasn't part of the pop culture nearly as much as today. Anyway, the hold is holding someone at their mercy precisely as a function of preparing in a conventional, therefore intelligible fashion, the spectacle of suffering, of methodically establishing the conditions of suffering. The inertia of the vanquished allows the temporary victor to settle in his cruelty and to convey to the public this terrifying slowness of the torturer, who is certain about the outcome of his actions, to grind the face of one's powerless adversary or to scrape his spine with one's fist with a deep and regular movement, or at least produce the superficial appearance of such gestures. Wrestling is the only sport which gives such an externalized vision of torture. But here again, only the image is involved in the game, and the spectator does not wish for the actual suffering of the contestant. He only enjoys the perfection of an iconography. It is not true that wrestling is a sadistic spectacle. It is only an intelligible spectacle. So we might compare wrestling, which people say is, disgusting and base, and a lot of the stuff, I watched some of the 90s stuff, and it's pretty bad. Like a guy pulling down his pants and shoving the other guy's face into his ass. I mean, that's pretty gross. But the suffering, the actual suffering, is on the whole much less than in a UFC fight, like a real fight where the goal is just to kick the other guy in the leg until he can't stand up anymore. So the audience here is a tad bit more refined because they don't actually desire their heroes and villains to truly suffer. They just have to appear to be suffering. Similar to in a movie, you don't actually want the bad guy the actor to be in pain, but you need to see him in pain because that's justice. You need to see him lose at the end because that's what justice is for whatever he's done throughout the story. So it's the images of pain and the images of justice that the crowd wants, not the actual pain and actual justice. Who the fuck even knows what that is? Now the surface, even though it's all a superficial display, there's still rules to the display. Like don't actually hurt somebody, but more importantly than don't actually hurt someone is don't show that it's a fake. This is the law of kayfabe. He doesn't use those terms. He doesn't have them. I'm sure, apparently it's a circus term that goes back over 100 years, but he doesn't use that term here. And I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but I'll read it and try to give my interpretation here. There is another figure more spectacular still than the hold. It is the forearm smash and the loud slap of the forearm. Now, a forearm smash, it's just, I assume hitting someone with your forearm, but I think he means a clothesline, or what we call a clothesline, where you put your arm out and then they run into it and fall down. If you don't do it properly as a performer, there's a risk here, and we'll see what that is. This punch with which one clouts the chest of one's adversary and which is accompanied by a dull noise and an exaggerated sagging of the vanquished body. So maybe not a clothesline. Anyway, we'll see. In the forearm smash, catastrophe is brought to the point of maximum obviousness, so much so that ultimately the gesture appears as no more than a symbol. This is going too far. This is transgressing the moral rules of wrestling, where all signs must be excessively clear, but must not let the intention of clarity be seen. The public then shouts, "He's laying it on," not because it regrets the absence of real suffering, but because it condemns artifice. As in the theater, one fails to put the part across as much by an excess of sincerity as by an excess of formalism. So tell me if I'm wrong, but what I think he's saying here is if you just hit someone with your forearm, there's not really much force behind that, and then you hit them in the chest and they fall over. Now, if you hit someone in the chest, unless they're very, very small compared to you or not ready for it, like that's not, you can't produce a lot of force by hitting them in the chest with your forearm, and yet the person seems to fall over from it. So I think what he's saying is, if you show the key behind the spectacle, which is that it's fake, then the audience gets upset. They don't get upset because someone's not actually suffering and they want him to be suffering. They get mad because they say, "Oh, he's faking it." And that's a crazy ironic thing to say in the middle of a wrestling match. Like, "Oh, he's faking being hurt." You would say that in a soccer match or a football match, like when a guy gets his toe nicked and then falls over and starts screaming to the sky. That's when you say he's laying it on. You can't do that in a wrestling match, but the irony, the layer of irony here, is the whole thing's fake, and the audience is yelling at the ref in the wrestling match, "Hey, he's faking being hurt," when of course the entire thing is a fakery. So the rule, this shows a rule, which is you cannot be too fake or you will break the suspension of disbelief here. Now there's a political dimension to this too. The point to take away from it is that the audience doesn't want to know that it's fake, and they're yelling at the ref that it's fake, but you have to give them enough. You have to give them enough to suspend disbelief. So Trump has to give his cult just enough so that they can continue to believe in him, because they already want to believe. It's their desire to believe. They go to the theater, they go to the rally in order to believe. But if you're in a wrestling match and you just like poke someone and they fall over, they're going to be upset by that. That's against the rules. But if you establish, I don't know, this is off the top of my head. If you establish, I went to Japan to learn from an ancient master a magic way to do a poke so that it completely sends the guy flying across the room, then okay, like that's okay. Now it's narratively justified, as long as you justify why something so obviously fake is happening. But the point to take away from this in terms of politics is that you have to give your audience, in a kayfabe scenario, you have to give them just enough to be able to suspend their disbelief, and they will work with whatever you give them. Everyone knows, I mean, I think I'm gonna have some faith in humanity here. I think that down in their soul somewhere, everybody knows that Fox News doesn't believe what it says. That Fox News hosts are characters, and people want to see their characters owning the libs and supporting their guy and calling out hypocrisy on the other side and calling the other side evil. They're giving them all the symbols that they want. Remember what happened with Tucker Carlson when he got fired all of a sudden, like the most popular television host of the most popular show, and he got fired all of a sudden. And what was it for? There's a lawsuit that he was lying about the election being rigged through these voting machines, but the texts leaked where Tucker Carlson said, "I'm so sick of talking about this story. Everyone knows it's a lie," or something like that. And everyone knows that this isn't true, and I don't believe it. And so this seems to me like a plausible reason for why he's fired, because your audience is going to go with whatever you say up to the point when you're like, "No, I was just I was lying for money, or I was lying because it's my job. And I mean, even in that case, I think he probably could have survived. But to have texts leak from reality into the kayfabe that says, I don't believe what I'm saying. Maybe they saw that, Fox News saw that as too much of a breaking of kayfabe to the point that he had lost his credibility. Now, the irony here, just like with them yelling at the ref, oh, he's faking it. The irony here is that, like, you should, some part of your soul, again, it's probably not true, but some part of your soul has to know that these people can't possibly believe what they're saying. The same way that an Alex Jones watcher, they're watching it the way they watch wrestling. They're not watching it because they truly believe it. Now, there might be a few that do. Okay, but I'm gonna again place my faith in humanity here and suggest that a lot of the audience wants the kayfabe of it. They don't want the truth value measure of it. Because even though everyone kind of knows he's lying, and even if the election probably wasn't stolen, but I need everyone, including myself as a Fox News viewer, we need to not give up this aspect of the kayfabe that the election was stolen. That's like an identifying part of the myth for Donald Trump now, because he's fighting against a rigged system. If the system's not rigged, then Trump has no purpose. If Trump has no purpose, then his cult has no purpose. So the most important thing is keeping belief in the purpose going. And by saying, I don't believe this conspiracy that I'm peddling here, as Tucker's text messages did, that's way too risky to keep around. Just like a wrestler who's not a good enough actor, who flies across the ring from not a big enough punch, or who flies too far, it breaks the suspension of disbelief that is the purpose of this entire apparatus. The entire apparatus is to funnel belief into a narrative arc where you're on the side of the good. There's my application. This reminds me of something I saw in this Netflix documentary. There was a moment in the 90s. There's a few, like, you know how we're talking about the death of art and the death of history and the end of history and all that, all these Baudrillardian implosion of truth. There was a moment of this in the WWF. And what happened was there was sworn rivals, like a group of sworn rivals, half were on one team, half were on the other, and they hated each other. But rumors were coming out that these guys were actually friends. And these rumors were damaging to the kayfabe that everyone participates in. These guys are sworn enemies. Anyway, two of them got bought out by a different league. There was two leagues of wrestling in the early 90s, and you're like a fan of one or the fan of the other. And two of them were leaving to go to the other league. And on their last night as rivals, they do their fight, they do their bout. And this was not on TV, interestingly. They had to use cell phone footage in the documentary, the Netflix documentary, because it wasn't on pay-per-view, it wasn't televised. And I think it was for the reason that it wasn't televised, that the CEO guy, McMahon, said, okay, yeah, you can go for it. But these sworn enemies on two sides, because two of them were leaving and there were rumors floating around that these guys were all actually friends behind the scenes, they kind of got together and did like a group hug, like, okay, we're leaving tomorrow. It was great. And this exploded in the wrestling world because only the people that were in the stadium actually saw this happen, but it exploded on the message boards. I don't think they had any of the sites that we have currently, but whatever sites were there in 1998, it exploded because they had broke kayfabe. And even in this documentary, there's old wrestlers just going like, they shouldn't have done that. That was when kayfabe died, when enemies just hugged on stage to be like, okay, you guys are going. So the whole thing is, everyone knows this is a spectacle. Everyone knows these guys are probably friends. But you can never give away that you are actually friends. You can never put that into image form, even outside of the ring. You can't go to the bar together. You can't go anywhere you can be photographed. You don't do interviews together. And if you do interviews together, then you have to, ham it up, pretend like you want to kill each other in the interview, all this stuff. But breaking kayfabe is sacred in the Durkheim sense. This is the thing that kept wrestling together for about 100 years. So in addition to art being ended and truth being imploded and politics being ended, wrestling ended in the view of a lot of these older wrestlers because they did something against the sacred. They made the sacred, they did the taboo act, which is breaking kayfabe. Now, Tucker admitting that he doesn't believe what he says is also committing the ultimate sin in political kayfabe. So I guess here there's actually two ways to sin. One is by making it obvious that it's a fake, by falling down from too weak of a hit, and the other is to let reality into the mythology. Because as soon as reality comes in, then you realize this is like a house of cards based on these assembled signs. But if you let kayfabe in, or if you let reality into the kayfabe, then the kayfabe collapses because you can no longer suspend your disbelief. We could take a digression here, actually. Back to some of my stuff 3 years ago about Lacan. In the sense that for Lacan, reality, which is the imaginary and the symbolic, this is meant to maintain for your psyche, for your individual psyche, you're holding back real. You're using reality to maintain plausible deniability that what you secretly suspect is real is not. And psychologically, all of us, this isn't just wrestling fans or Trump fans, right? We're able to put up with an immense amount of contradictory evidence in order to maintain our fantasy about ourselves. And usually in Lacan's sense, it's that we, as an identity, have significance, that our desires are significant. That's basically what reality is like giving narrative structure to your desire and making it, normal. I'm pretty good. I'm not the bad guy here. The universe owes me, it doesn't owe me everything, but it owes me a little bit of something. I deserve the recognition of the other. So, wow, yeah. In that sense, we're all living our own personal kayfabe that the real disrupts from time to time, either in sublime moments or in horrifying moments. So this, I don't know, the term that Durkheim uses, collective unconscious, is maybe just a Lacanian, this is anachronistic, but it's a Lacanian denial of the real on a social scale. And in that sense, I know I'm using lower class examples. It's wrestling and it's Trump, but this is what our mind is for, basically, in the psychoanalytic sense. It's for repressing the parts that we don't want to be part of reality. Never thought of it that way before. Anyway, where was I in here? Classical wrestling, or Golden Age wrestling, which is up to 1993, I think. This is about justice or justice being done. The signs of justice. Like, it's not real justice because the actual heel didn't do anything actually wrong. He just acted wrong. So we're exchanging the signs so he gets punished for acting wrong, even though we know, the heel might be just a perfectly fine guy to get a beer with. But we're not allowed to believe that as a wrestling fan. So let's look at the justice structure here. What wrestling, above all, is meant to portray, right here, if you're following, is a purely moral concept, that of justice. The idea of paying is essential to wrestling, and the crowd's "give it to him" means, above all, make him pay, make him pay. This is therefore, needless to say, an imminent justice. The baser the action of the bastard, or the heel, the more delighted the public is by the blow by which he justly receives in return, the finishing knockout. If the villain, who is of course a coward, takes refuge behind the ropes, claiming unfairly to have the right to do so by brazen mimicry, he is inexorably pursued there and caught, and the crowd is jubilant at seeing the rules broken for the sake of a deserved punishment. So the heel, because he's a coward, runs away from the hero. He goes outside the ring, and the hero breaks the rules by leaving the ring to go and pursue him. So it's not breaking the rules that's the highest goal here. It's that justice is served. For a wrestling fan, nothing is finer than the revengeful fury of a betrayed fighter who throws himself vehemently not on a successful opponent, but on the smarting image of foul play, so the cheater. Good guys, you don't break the rules to hurt a good guy, but you can break the rules to hurt a bad guy. Naturally is the pattern of justice which matters here much more than its content. And here we get the sense that he doesn't believe there's a real justice. Wrestling is above all a quantitative sequence of compensations, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This explains why sudden changes of circumstances have, in the eyes of wrestling habitués, a sort of moral beauty. They enjoy them as they would an inspired episode in a novel. And the greater the contrast between the success of a move and the reversal of fortune, the nearer the good luck of a contestant to his downfall, the more satisfying the dramatic mime is felt to be. Justice is therefore the embodiment of a possible transgression. It is from the fact that there is a law that the spectacle of passions which infringe it derives its value. So, yeah, the law of justice, if the heel breaks the rules, he's earned a greater punishment. And that's ultimately what people up to the Attitude Era went to wrestling to see. It's a sort of catharsis. I don't get justice in my everyday life, but this image, the series of image, proves that justice is a true concept in the social. Now, I'm going to give you my analysis of this, but first, there's one more quotation that I want to make sure I get to. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this is the difference between French wrestling and American wrestling. Sorry, I'm burping. It has already been noted that in America, wrestling represents a sort of mythological fight between good and evil of a quasi-political nature. The bad wrestler always being supposed to be a red. So a communist, basically. The bad guy's always a communist, a Russian, something like that. And here, he's a sheik. So America always has political countries as the bad guys, at least in the 1950s. This fight's from the 80s, and it's still true here. It's no longer true in the 90s, right? When the enemy becomes the system, the rigged system. Anyway, that's America. The process of creating heroes in French wrestling is very different, being based on ethics, not on politics. So, yeah, he's calling, as French intellectuals do, he's calling Americans, they have children's morality. They have Disney morality brain. The French are a little more refined, but not much. What the public is looking for here in France is the gradual construction of a highly moral image, that of the perfect bastard. So the bastard, again, is the heel. One comes to wrestling in order to attend the continuing adventures of a single major leading character, permanent and multiform like Punch or Scapino. I don't know who Scapino is. Punch is a really popular French puppet, I believe, if I'm up on my French culture lore. Blah, blah, blah. Let's skip some stuff. Moliere. The stylized character does not belong to any particular nation or party. So the French don't hate communists, at least in the 50s, the way that Americans do. The bad guy is just a communist. But what then is a bastard for this audience composed in part, we are told, of people who are themselves outside the rules of society? So this is a French, he's doing some French psychology based on these people that he's mentioned. The French get their identity of Frenchness from, not following the rules or not following unjust rules, perhaps, but having a personal ethics outside. Like the second they raise the retirement age by a year, then half of France revolts. So he's giving some justification to our stereotype of the Frenchman who goes, oh, there's a non-smoking sign, I'm going to smoke under it, right? So the French is already a rebel. So you can't have the good guy just be someone who breaks the rules. It has to be a little bit more than that. So how do we have a bad guy in France if everyone's breaking the rules? It can't be someone who just simply breaks the rules, right? Essentially someone unstable who accepts the rules only when they are useful to him and transgresses the formal continuity of attitudes. So the French bad guy, the French bastard, is someone who uses the rules when they are to his advantage and then breaks them at other times. So basically, in French society, the heel is not someone who breaks the rules, because everybody does that, but the heel is a hypocrite. He is unpredictable, therefore asocial. He takes refuge behind the law when he considers it to be in his favor, and breaks it when he finds it useful to do so. Something he rejects the formal boundaries of in the ring and goes on hitting an adversary legally protected by the ropes. Sometimes he reestablishes these boundaries and claims the protection of what he did not respect a few minutes earlier. This inconsistency, far more than treachery or cruelty, sends the audience, the French audience, beside itself with rage, offended not in its morality, but in its logic. It considers the contradiction of arguments as the basest of crimes. The forbidden move becomes dirty only when it destroys a quantitative equilibrium and destroys the rigorous reckoning of compensations. So, I'll just finish it. What is condemned by the audience is not at all the transgression of insipid official rules, because that makes you a hero in French culture to break the rules. It is in the lack of revenge, the absence of punishment. So there is nothing more exciting for a crowd than the grandiloquent kick given to the vanquished bastard. The joy of punishing is at its climax when supported by a mathematical justification. Contempt is then unrestrained. One is no longer dealing with a salud, a bastard, but with a salope, which is like a bitch or a pussy. The verbal gesture of the ultimate degradation. So you can be if you're a bastard in French society, you're still good. It's when you become a bitch, then you're bad, which is using the rules sometimes to your benefit and not others. Whereas it's very French to not abide by the rules. So yeah, he's saying we have an ethics based on logic, whereas American ethics is simply based on nationalism. If you're from Russia or Iran, you're bad. If you're from America, you're good. And the French have their own moral system, which is a little more nuanced, but this is what wrestling turns into, right? In the 90s, it becomes the corrupt system is the enemy. So Americans get a little more French over time. Let me see if there's anything else I need in here. We see here a few key terms. This is the great legendary themes of mythology. And then I just highlighted this last paragraph, so we'll see what he's going with it. This grandiloquence is nothing but the popular and age-old image of the perfect intelligibility of reality. What is portrayed by wrestling is therefore an ideal understanding of things. It is the euphoria of men raised for a while above the constitutive ambiguity of everyday situations and placed before the panoramic view of a univocal nature, in which signs at last correspond to causes without obstacle, without evasion, and without contradiction. So there is no friction here. Like he said, you can see the second you see the two fighters come out, you know everything that's going to happen, but you need to watch it happen, and you need to believe, in a sense, that it's happening. You can't, as you're spectating, you don't get stuck unless you're a poo-poo. You don't get stuck thinking, well, he didn't really hit him. Well, he didn't really hit him with that chair, or that chair is actually collapsible. He's fine. You don't think like that. You go there to see justice in its pure form that doesn't need to be interpreted. So this is kind of anti-literary in the complex moral themes of like a Dostoevsky novel or something like that. People don't want that complication. They want to, just like Disneyland, they go there to believe in the myth of society. And the myth of society in this case is that justice exists. It's the same reason these Disney movies have very simplistic moral themes. And, this kind of disappears, right? Even from Disney mythology and Star Wars mythology in the 90s. It's kind of the 90s that's the site of all this simplistic moral character becoming more complicated in art. And it's probably just because like no one believes in it anymore. And there's a great advertisement of the WWE when they're switching into what's called the Attitude Era, which is Steve Austin is the main figure of it. When they get really raunchy and sexual and bad, and they're sticking guys' face in their ass. They became much more PG more recently. But anyway, complicating this black and white morality, they said in the ad, this is the new WWF. This isn't your daddy's WWF when the good guy always wins. This is for adults now. And we still have, when we signify what we like to the people around us, like saying I like Sopranos is much more sophisticated than saying I like Star Wars, because Star Wars is essentially for children. But when we look at politics and look at debate culture or look at any number of things online, it's clear that some part of us, or some part of most people deep down, craves an imagistic morality that is purely on the surface, that doesn't require any of this interpretation. Now, I wanted to read the last line. In the ring, and even in the depths of their voluntary ignominy, wrestlers remain gods, because they are, for a few moments, a key which opens nature, capitalized. The pure gesture which separates good from evil and unveils the form of a justice which is at last intelligible. And before I was picking on some of those academics who are like, no, this is a morality play and morality plays are good. You can tell from this last line here, Bart says, this is at last intelligible, which signals to me, and I think it should signal to anybody, he doesn't believe that justice is some cosmic force. Justice is a social force. Justice is a social creation that we need rituals, especially artistic rituals, to continue believing in. And wrestling is an ignominious, is that how you say it? Is an ignominious version of this that's also associated with, the lower classes. the uneducated lower classes. And that's because, it's children's morality, for the most part. Now, to interpret this a little bit, the ritual of the wrestling match, even in its more complicated form, even in the Attitude Era, when it's like, this is for adults, not for children, they just change the terms of good and evil to I was going to say alienated, but the salt of the earth, solid, manly dude who's just getting fucked by a rigged system, which is the story of the white working class in particular, the working class in general. But it's a largely white working class viewed sport. Let me gather my bearings here a sec. Okay. Now, the easiest way to break this down, because we are all readers and people with time to read very complicated books, most of my example, the Trump example is just like obviously the best one. And Trumpism, I think, certainly bears every resemblance to a religious cult, which is why contrary information, whether it's true or not, does not introduce contradictions into the logic of the system, because it's a cultic system. It's a mythological system. I think my second or third video on YouTube was about MAGAism as a cult. And this is the stupid version of a cult. I've said before, I'm still working it out, but I think that all little knowledge structures and the societies that are based around knowledge structures, including academic philosophy, they have cultic elements that protect some sort of inside, protect a kernel inside that we don't want to do away with. We don't want that illusion dispelled. Same with the Lacan thing. There's an illusion about ourself and our significance and the significance of our desire and the fact that others owe us to take us seriously, at least a little bit. Not too arrogantly, but others owe it to us something. All of this is meant to maintain the kayfabe world. So I don't mean to say, oh, this explains stupid people's actions and not smart people's actions. Because the smart version of this, if it's like New Yorker liberals or theorists or even like us, really, the smart version of it is to say, well, we aren't stupid like those guys, so we must be outside of the kayfabe structure. We're outside of anything like wrestling. We're boxing fans, we must be normal and smart because all the stupidity is over there. And Trumpism is the Disneyland for the stupid people, where we write about Disneyland in our theories. But our being normal and smart over here as opposed to over there, with our college degrees and like bookshelves full of books, the fact that we watch HBO and understand it instead of watching wrestling or reality TV, or even like the fact that we know America is immoral and Israel is doing a genocide, and we do historical materialism, so we understand that. Maybe I'll pose this as a question instead. Israel kayfabe, I don't want to go there. But to what extent are these simply our set of signs in our left-wing morality wrestling match, right? That's what helps us. I mean, you and I, and we're internet-brained leftists who don't think Marx is the devil. That's how I'll say us. We definitely have a similar system of morality. And is it too a kayfabe? I'm going to guess probably. I don't really feel comfortable answering that in the definitive because I don't actually know. And if we're in it, it would be hard to tell. But, getting called a snob or getting called a soft-hand academic, that's indications within the left side of the moral system that we have a moral system. And what's his name? I'm blanking again. Durkheim. Durkheim says that the moral authority is potentially, he's not certain about it, but potentially the moral authority is the system of any system of authority, including, that would mean, what it means to be a good leftist. But I think it's worth looking at, okay, if we have a system of morality that's based on a certain kayfabe, a suspension of disbelief, then who are the heels? Who are the people we find most repugnant? And I've been thinking, I don't know about you, but like I don't find Trump and what's his name? Andrew Tate. I don't really find them evil, you know? I find them comical. The people that I find evil, or maybe I'll generalize it, not me, but the people that get the most backlash from leftists are people like Hillary Clinton and Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson I'll never say a good thing about. Zizek, when Zizek kind of went from face to heel a little bit in the post world by writing in Compact Magazine and by saying big trans, right? But finding Hillary Clinton and Jordan Peterson to be irredeemable and more of a threat than people like Tucker Carlson or Trump is because they're closer to us, right? So if they're closer to you, they're closer to the secret that's at the heart of your morality system. Jordan Peterson, because he's a PhD academic who taught at Harvard and U of T, and Hillary Clinton, because she's ostensibly in the left party while doing nothing leftistly enough. And Zizek turns from heel or from baby face to heel much quicker than anyone else would for saying things that are, kind of innocuous, but you'd think he killed a baby. But he said taboo terms like blaming things on big trans, which of course I don't agree with, right? I'm describing my morality system. Saying things are big trans, and then maybe he's a crypto liberal or a closet authoritarian or whatever it is that Zizek lost his street cred. He broke the moral code of our side of the system, which is maintained, I would guess, by a sort of kayfabe, where if you betray it, you're treated much more harshly for betraying it than you would be if you just started like Andrew Tate or Tucker Carlson. If you started over there, that's not nearly as bad as the betrayal. Because like Barth said about French wrestling as opposed to American wrestling, betrayal is far worse than being evil, or being a hypocrite is far worse than just being a reprehensible evil person. So it turns out, another one is Bernie. When Bernie didn't come out against Israel enough, right? Like, he was just a Zionist all along. And then they get like not actually canceled, but canceled from that particular moral system, or one of the many people who's left the left. Anyway, I thought this was worth thinking about, because otherwise it's like, oh, look how stupid this is. This happens over there. This is a low class thing. Where probably any moral system has this kernel, the kernel at the center, which everyone needs to defend. Otherwise, it falls apart. And that's the same thing in wrestling. The kernel at the center is that everyone acts like they believe it. They act out belief in it. And acting out belief in it is far more important than whether or not it's true. So in conclusion, I've been saying for a while here that image is everything. You have to look at the surface, look at the images, not what it represents, because what it represents might be nothing. But what the ritual does is reproduce community, communal values, reproduces society virtually out of nothing. You take a piece of bread and it reproduces the whole Christian body because of the ritual. And the only reason that a ritual has any power is because that people believe it. Otherwise, that's really stupid. But the notion of justice is not out there in nature. The notion of justice that Barth here is talking about, it can't be produced somewhere else. It's only produced in the texts of Plato and then through rituals or in the Christian religion. I guess Christianity says we don't do the eye for an eye. Old Testament religion, then any religion prior to Christianity says, justice is eye for an eye. You kill my brother, I get to kill your brother. But yeah, the idea that can be performed in a cathartic form so that we can still believe in that sort of justice. Not the way our justice system works. So that means that justice can't be found anywhere else, and that a wrestling match is a Disneyland function. Bum, bum, bum. Wasn't a big surprise, but it's a really good one, right? The terrifying flip side of that, though, is if the Disneyland function of wrestling is the thing that produces justice, the terrifying flip side could be that, well, this is just all wrestling. It's all perfectly accessible with no secret meaning at the heart of it. That's, I guess, I keep coming back to Lacan here because of that notion of the real that's haunting reality always, but the last thing we can ever do, because it would tear everything apart, it would shatter everything, would be to admit that reality is contingent rather than necessary. Because in the wrestling function, or in the wrestling match, necessity is what determines that the criminal or the heel, the bad guy, is going to get what's coming to him, even when that doesn't happen in everyday life. But if this is just a contingent faith that has no basis in reality, which is something that we're kind of waking up to, and it's terrifying everybody, is that maybe, justice was just something completely made up. Prior to intelligibility, at least. And that's what this last line means. We finally made the concepts on which civilization is based intelligible via a ritual. And the ritual seems very stupid in wrestling. Like, it seems low class and base. But we also have our more complicated types of ritual, which involve, taking to Twitter to chastise Zizek, or getting on your podcast and chastising Zizek when he says something. It's a kayfabe morality that maybe there's nothing at the center of it except for those expressions of ignominy. Not good to end on a word that I don't know how to say. Anyway, I feel like that was a lot. 2 hours. I hope it was worth the wait. I can't wait for your comments. Lots to think about here, namely that morality is just a social system, and social systems are not based on truths. They're based on signs. So you can't contradict them with truths. You have to the best you can do is contradict them with other signs. And you kind of see this when, I don't know why the election turned out this way, but calling Trump weird and just a weirdo who's obsessed with weird stuff, that really deflated the face of him, the baby face sense of he's the one taking on the system is corrupt, trying to take him down, trying to throw lawsuits at him. And then you go, no, he's a weirdo. He's actually not a manly man. That was it cuts to the heart of the sign. It doesn't cut to the truth of it. It cuts to the sign of it. And signs potentially in moral systems that have nothing behind them but belief, faith, and passion. And if we are in the post-truth era, then all we're going to be left with is belief, faith, and passion. And The other side's good at it. Our morality is kind of scoldy. Maybe we need to change it up. Anyway, lots to think about. Can't wait for your comments.